All right. Hello, folks. Welcome in. Welcome. We'll give a few minutes for some other folks to trickle in. I know we've got a bunch of other attendees, so we'll just wait for a bit. I see folks starting to trickle in now. All right, we'll give it just one more minute and then we'll jump into things and folks can continue to come on in as we get started. Alrighty, so let's kick things off. Hello, everyone. I'm Danielle Gata. I'm the Public Programs and Visitor Services Manager at the Morris-Jumel Mansion. And welcome back to our second installment of Connect260, celebrating our 260th anniversary. Our June session, the theme is going to be building a new nation. So we're going to do a lot of talking about the Revolutionary War, which was such a pivotal point in time in New York and the nation, but also in the mansion's history. So I'm really excited to have you here. But if it is your first time joining us today or you're watching this on YouTube after the fact and you don't know anything about the mansion, here is some fun, fast facts for you. The Morris-Jumel Mansion is celebrating 260 years this year. It was built in 1765 and it's the oldest remaining house in Manhattan. It was listed in the National Register of Historic Places in 1966 and then designated as an individual landmark in 1967 and an interior landmark in 1975 by the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission. It was built on the ancestral land of the Lenape people and was likely built and funded using enslaved labor. Then it was used as Washington's headquarters in 1776. But it also housed really awesome and important people like Madame Eliza Jamel, former Vice President Aaron Burr, and Anne Northup, who is the wife of Solomon Northup, who you may know from either reading the book, which is his autobiography and memoir, 12 Years a Slave, or from the movie that was produced rather recently. But there are also so many more awesome and amazing folks who have passed through the house and wandered the halls. And it also is one of my favorite fun facts, a place that inspired Lin-Manuel Miranda, who wrote parts of Hamilton, which is celebrating 10 years on Broadway. At the mansion in the Aaron Burr bedroom, you could go and see the chair that he sat in while writing some of those hit songs. So pretty cool fact. And then just some housekeeping updates as always for June going into July. On June 21st, which is this Saturday, we have a summer picnic concert with the Washington Heights Chamber Orchestra. One thing that we also have going on during the day before that, so you can make a whole day of it, is New York City Parks is recruiting volunteers to help with the upkeep of our garden. We're on a 1 acre parcel of land. There's lots of flowers and trees and different things that need a lot of taking care of. So if you have a green thumb, probably better than I am at having a green thumb by a big margin, we need your help. So come on out from 2 to 4 and then make a day of it. Hang out, watch the Washington Heights Chamber Orchestra play in the garden, bring some dinner. It'll be really nice. And then on July 12th, we have Family and Community Day. On July 16th, We have another Connect260. The theme moving forward into the antebellum period, following that timeline we have in our exhibition, is A Woman's House in a Man's World with Eliza Jamel's biographer, Margaret Oppenheimer. So that promises to definitely be something really interesting. Margaret always has a new tidbit of information whenever we talk. So promises to be fun. And then speaking of more fun, we have our Tavern Night fundraiser on July 18th, 2025. So literally a month away. I'm really, really excited. We've got a lot of really, really cool sponsors, and lots of fun planned, live music, gaming, help presented with the help of Phillips Manor Hall up in Yonkers, Mary Morris's original family home, and lots of fun in store for that. And then we have another movie in the park this summer on July 24th. Once it gets dark, so around 8 p.m., we'll be playing Puss in Boots: The Last Wish in the park, and that's free. So bring the little ones in your life to check that out. And finally, to wrap things up on the update section, What the House Saw, 260 years from the Morris collection of stories from the Morris-Jumel Mansion collection and community is now open. We opened last Saturday. Everything looks amazing, and come on by and see it if you haven't already. So, before I introduce our guest for this evening, I want to just run through quickly how to submit questions. On your screen, you'll see the option to input something into the Q&A portion of the chat. Please do. Once Dan is done sharing his slides and lecturing for the evening, then we'll move into the Q&A portion. I'll come back. I'll be the voice of the audience. I'll read off the questions that are submitted. And we'll have a nice conversation about what you folks have to ask about the conversation that we're having today. So now I just want to introduce, before turning over the imaginary microphone, Dan Levatino, who is the executive director of Trinity Church Cemetery, which, if you didn't know, is the place where the Battle of Harlem Heights took place. The Battle of Harlem Heights, the major part of that skirmish was right on that property. And that is what connects the Morris-Jumel Mansion and Trinity Church kind of at the core, all the way back going to the land. And so I'm really excited to have him here today to discuss everything that went on connecting our house and Trinity Church at that time in 1776, and that fateful battle that really turned morale around for Washington and the Continental Army, and all sorts of fun stuff there. So I am going to turn over the microphone without further ado to Dan, and we'll get things started.
Great. Thank you so much, Danielle. Hi, everybody. Danielle's already done the introductions. I'm Dan Levatino from Trinity Church Cemetery and Mausoleum. For those who don't know, we're located at 153rd Street between Amsterdam and Riverside Drive, and we're just a short horseback ride away from the Morris Mansion, where Washington was stationed in the Harlem headquarters. During this presentation, I will refer to Morris-Jumel Mansion as the Morris Mansion or the Harlem headquarters. Washington spent time there from September 15th through October 21st. The cemetery's connection to the Morris Mansion and the Harlem headquarters at the time was the positioning of the middle redoubt of the defenses of Fort Washington. So a redoubt, for those who don't know, is a series of barricades, trenches, breastworks, and gun emplacements that obviously create the defenses. And the middle redoubt was a rather stout construction and stretched nearly across Manhattan Island from river to river. I've prepared a timeline of some of the key events of the Revolution that I hope will provide context to the Manhattan battle. So we'll go back a bit and cover some key events, and then we'll move quickly through the timeline and discuss the three Manhattan engagements in greater detail. I hope to provide some insight into General Washington's time at the Harlem headquarters and the key issues he was dealing with at that time. Um, I, I I like this slide because it just reminds us that the New York campaign was brutal. It was dire and it was crucial, and it was quite a struggle for both sides. It's rarely talked about as being significant in American history, mostly because it was deemed an abject failure for the American side. I hope at the end of this presentation we can revisit its significance and talk about some of the positive outcomes that were actually achieved. So going back far enough to Lexington and Concord, what we know here is that the British were stationed in Boston, and there was tons of tension. There was lots of problems, and the British were reconnoitering. They were heading out from Boston, and they were heading into the Massachusetts countryside, and basically taking supplies, procuring meat, food, grain, and everything else that the army needed. Uh, Americans were getting fed up with the situation. Eventually, there was rumor of arms, a cache of arms being kept at Concord, and the British set out from Boston to seize that cache of arms. Uh, Paul Revere rode out in advance of the army, letting all the militia know along the way that the British were coming, and the militia turned out in great numbers and harassed the British back and forth from Concord, from Lexington and Concord. This is April 19, 1775. The blue will be my new slide captions. Trying to keep the timeline in your face and available for you to see as we move through these dates. So roughly 3 weeks later, the Americans, took a little page from the British book and decided they were going to seize their own artillery. So they went to the lightly defended Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York, and they managed to seize, I believe it was 78 cannons, with nearly no shots fired in that exchange. I mention that because that will come up again shortly. On June 17th, so 5 weeks later, we have the Battle of Bunker Hill. We had 1,200 American militiamen stationed on Breed's Hill, overlooking Boston Harbor and the city of Boston itself. The British could not allow the Americans to stay in that position, and they attacked with 3,000 men. They found out the hard way that the Americans could fight and would fight. With the superior position that the Americans had, they put up quite a fight and gave a bruising to the British, the much vaunted British Army, the greatest fighting force in the world at the time. There was 226 killed on the British side and 828 wounded. This was a very bad black eye for the British. The only reason that the Americans ended up giving ground on Bunker Hill is because they ran out of ammunition. Gunpowder was not something that was readily available in the Americas at the time. Um, okay, moving on. July 2nd, 1775, George Washington arrives in Cambridge to take command of the army. So Washington was not a part of Bunker Hill. And when he arrives, he finds things in quite a mess, but begins to try to professionalize the army, if professionalize is actually a word. Um, on January 8th, so we've had some 6 months of siege, the siege of Boston. Washington and the army have encircled Boston, and they're preventing reinforcement. They're preventing resupply. They are attempting to blockade Boston Harbor. They have privateers harassing Boston shipping. So the British are getting in a bad way there in Boston. They're running out of supplies. They're pinned in, and at that point on January 8th, uh, Thomas Knowlton, who is a hero of Bunker Hill, was involved in Lexington and Concord. He leads an excursion against the British barracks near Bunker Hill. I mention this because Colonel Knowlton's going to figure strongly in the story later along the way. Then on January 27th, uh, Henry Knox arrives from Fort Ticonderoga with the captured cannon that was captured back on May 10th. And this is quite a feat of accomplishment. They drove 58 cannon on sleds using oxen 300 miles through a New England winter to get these cannon delivered to Washington and Cambridge. That leads to a very good outcome for the Americans, the capture of Dorchester Heights. Hopefully you can see my little map here. Not my map, but the United States Academy Department of History's map. Dorchester Heights had been left bare. Neither the Americans nor the British were occupying Dorchester Heights. When Henry Knox arrives with the cannon, Washington decides it's time to take Dorchester Heights. And he pulls off, and the army together, they pull off a rather amazing feat. In a single night, they threw up barricades, defenses, encampments, entrenchments. They put the cannon on Dorchester Heights in one single overnight effort. That simply surprised and led to the evacuation of Boston by the British. What happened was Washington had all of these defenses, pre-built behind the hills where they couldn't be seen, and everything was staged and ready to be thrown up. And they worked tirelessly for a few days to prepare. And then nightfall came on one night, a particularly dark night, and all of a sudden 10,000 men went into action, and they threw up these incredible defenses and cannon on the heights. And that put Boston Harbor under threat of cannon, and ultimately forced the evacuation from Boston. And this is Washington's really his first brilliant maneuver. That essentially ends the siege of Boston, and the British retreat to Halifax, where they regroup and resupply. At that point, Washington figures their next move is to come to New York. So on April 13th, 1776, General Washington arrives in New York City. He had sent ahead of him Colonel Charles Lee, who was tasked with setting up the defenses of New York City. Uh, whether New York City could be defended or should be defended was some big questions that needed answering. Many thought it should not be defended, that it could not be defended, and Congress insisted that it would be defended, that America would not give up its second largest city without a fight. Then on June 28th, the British do not strike in New York. They strike in Charleston, South Carolina. Major Lee had been sent down, or General Lee had been sent down to South Carolina, and he was able to thwart that attack and drive off General Clinton. So the British are unable to establish a southern beachhead. Just a few days later, on July 3rd, the British land on Staten Island. This is a very large contingent of men. This is 30,000 men and 400 ships landing unopposed in New York. We all know what happens on July 4th. And then on July 9th, General Washington has the Declaration of Independence read in the Commons in Manhattan, in New York. And I really like this image because it has St. Paul's Chapel in the foreground here, and farther back you can see Trinity Church. St. Paul's Chapel, of course, this still stands today as it did then. And Trinity Church, well, you're going to learn about what happened to Trinity Church. On July 12th, Admiral Howe arrives. So General Howe is the overall commander. His brother is Admiral Howe, and he is the commander of the British Navy. As soon as he arrives, he orders the Phoenix, which is a 44-gun frigate, and the Rose, which is a 20-gun gunship, into the Hudson River to defy and challenge the American naval defenses. It's nearly immediately apparent that the naval defenses are ineffective against the British Navy, and that Manhattan could be surrounded with relative ease. Obviously, if the army is on Manhattan and Manhattan is surrounded, then the army would be trapped and the war would end. So this is what Washington is dealing with. And it's a very precarious situation for the Americans. Here in this image, we can see the Americans attempt to destroy the Phoenix with fire ships. They set ships on fire and then tried to launch them at the enemy ships. It did not work. August 27th, then, about, what is that? A little less than 2 months since the British have arrived in Staten Island. The British have now landed on Long Island. And this leads to the Battle of Long Island, which is a very large engagement. It's not a good one for the Americans. Unfortunately, the American side was very well dug in. They were very well prepared. Everything looked like they were going to be able to put up quite a strong fight and really make the British pay for their efforts. And unfortunately, they failed to secure their far left flank. the Jericho Pass, where the British were able to essentially send a very large portion of their army through this narrow pass and outflank the Americans and just overwhelm them very quickly and make all the defenses and digging in that the Americans had done ineffective. The American side broke very quickly and was forced to retreat. American casualties were high. 300 killed, 800 wounded, and 1,000 captured. What's miraculous about this is that the Americans then, with 9,000 men having retreated from this battle, are sort of stuck on the end of Long Island. They're surrounded, basically half encircled, but trapped by water as well. So fully encircled, you could say. Um, and they pull off this really rather remarkable retreat where they move all 9,000 men overnight across the East River and back into Manhattan and into safety. This is a silent retreat. Men were ordered not to speak. Um, a contingent of men were set up to have a bunch of campfires and make a lot of camp noise as if they were, still in camp and doing normal things, while the rest of the army has pushed west and is trying to silently get themselves into any boat that they were able to find. Every boat that was anywhere near uh, Manhattan and Brooklyn at that time was put into service, and the entire 9,000 men were moved uh, back to Manhattan. This is really Washington's second miraculous maneuver. Dorchester Heights being the first, and the retreat from Long Island being the second. um, let's see. So that leaves us with 2 weeks where the Americans are on Manhattan Island and the British are on Staten Island and Long Island. And Washington is trying to figure out where the British are going to attempt to land in and take Manhattan. So this is September 15th, and in the overnight, somewhere between September 14th and the morning of September 15th, Washington arrives at the Morris Mansion. This is when he first arrives there. So on September 15th, the British are ready to make their attempt to land on Manhattan. In the Hudson, or the North River as it was at the time, they make a feint. They have a number of ships on the west side of Manhattan, and they make it look like they're about to land on the west side. In the meantime, in the East River, they had five ships that had been sitting idle in the river for a couple of days. And once they launched the feint in the Hudson, the ships in the East River flew into action, and they attacked at Kips Bay, which is or was, maybe it is still, um, East 32nd Street through the 36th Street or so, in that general area of Manhattan. And these five ships laid on a very heavy bombardment of the troops that were stationed at this location. The Americans had, I think it was about 450 troops stationed there because this was one of the potential landing sites. And when the bombardment began, Washington was at the Morris Mansion. He jumps on his horse and he rides down about 4 miles, 4 or 6 miles from the mansion down to the scene. When he gets there, he finds that the 400 Connecticut troops, who, in fairness to them, were only positioned in a very shallow trench. When the barrage happened, it was extremely close. It was incredibly loud, and it was very vicious. And it lasted for about an hour, and over 1,000 cannonball were fired at the men positioned in this shallow trench. Uh, the trench didn't offer much cover, um, and the men were quite concerned about their position. Through all the smoke and fire, uh, 4,000 British troops, British and Hessian troops, in 84 flatboats begin to emerge sort of, mystically out of this smoke and fire and land screaming and yelling and with their blood fully up as they make landfall. So that was it. That was too much for the American troops that were there, and without hardly even firing a shot, they broke and ran. Washington, when he arrived, found the men running uh, and retreating. He later said, "To my great surprise and mortification, I found the troops that had been posted in the lines retreating." Um, they were retreating quite energetically, and the 2,000 troops who were coming behind them to support them uh, became quite alarmed at the scene, and they also broke and ran. Uh, so this was really disturbing. Washington and General Putnam were riding amongst the men, and they were valiantly trying to get the men to regroup and get the men to seek cover and stand and fight. They were brandishing their swords and waving their pistols, but it was useless. Um, at that point, Washington's frustration was so great that his aides later claimed that they thought he appeared to be suicidal as he rode among the barrage and under the barrage, trying desperately to rally his troops. It took two of his aides to grab the reins of his horse and get him out of there. Um, the British then proceeded to march west across Manhattan, and they could have gone all the way to the Hudson River, but they chose not to, and that was a potential mistake because at the same time, the rest of Putnam's brigade was marching up the west side, right along the river under the tree line, and trying to escape north to Harlem Heights. Harlem Heights, where the mansion was and where the cemetery is now and where the Middle Redoubt was, that was the main American stronghold left in Manhattan. Um, New York, what we think of as New York, or what they thought of as New York, was just this little area at the bottom of what is now Manhattan. And Harlem Heights was really considered well up the country. So we had already, even though we were still occupying in Manhattan, we had already abandoned New York City. So you can imagine, and this is the end of Washington's first day at the mansion, and you can imagine that he's greatly demoralized at this point after what happened in Brooklyn, and then the inability to put up any kind of resistance to the landing on Manhattan. Washington is basically in despair, and he thinks, how can I get these men to fight? These men are not going to fight. They won't fight. And at that point, nearly a quarter of the army is sick. Scores of men are deserting every day, and this is really just turning into a disaster. Then the very next day comes the Battle of Harlem Heights. So don't let this map confuse you too much. And let me just tell the story before you try to get too far into this map. Um, the troops are stationed at the heights, mostly behind the middle redoubt. Um, and Washington is at the Morris Mansion. So he's ordered Colonel Knowlton, who we spoke of earlier, and his Connecticut Rangers to begin to probe south to try to figure out where the British have set up their lines. Now, Colonel Knowlton, he's been honored in this modern age as the father of American military intelligence. And he's also considered the father of American elite forces because his Rangers were the first, that can call themselves American elite forces. And the highest honor in military intelligence now is the Colonel Knowlton Award. So he is honored uh, in history, and so Washington orders Knowlton to begin probing south, and sure enough, he encounters a column of British soldiers, about 400 British soldiers marching north, also, searching for the Americans. And Knowlton's Rangers and the British skirmish back and forth, and quite a lively firefight ensues as Knowlton is sending word back to Washington that they have encountered the British. And this is taking place roughly around 110th Street of today's New York City. And as the skirmish continues, the Rangers are, wisely falling back, but they're fighting and falling back. They're experienced fighters, and they're doing it the right way. So Washington leaves the mansion and positions himself in some high ground where he can view what's taking place. So as Knowlton is falling back, he comes into what was known then as the Hollow Way. Nowadays, we think of the Hollow Way. The Hollow Way is roughly around 125th Street, Manhattanville area of Manhattan. You can think of it as, where the one train comes out from under the ground and starts being above ground before it goes back under. So that was the Hollow Way, and that is where this battle is beginning to unfold. So as the Rangers come out of the woods and into the Hollow Way, the British on their bugle play the song Gone Away, which is a fox hunting tradition that means that the fox has been caught and killed. So this is obviously a great insult, one that Washington was keenly aware of what this meant. Others in the Continental Army were also aware of what this meant, and it gave them energy and anger, and positioned them to want to fight back harder. So Washington orders a frontal assault, but at the same time, he orders a flanking maneuver from Colonel Knowlton and Major Leach. And their job is to get behind the British forces as they come out into the hollow and then cut off their retreat. The flanking maneuver, it doesn't work perfectly, but it works well enough uh, that they are surprise the British and put the British on their heels. You can see a depiction here of the flanking maneuver itself and the men coming in on the side of the British. Um, this is quite a firefight. This is there's 1,800 Americans engaged in this battle and 5,000 British ultimately. So this is not a skirmish, even though Washington would describe it as a skirmish later. This is quite a battle, and the firefight lasted about 90 minutes. Um, there was 30 killed on the American side and 90 killed on the British side. The British eventually are forced to fall back. They're pursued by the Americans, and they have to keep going south to seek safety. Um, and Washington, fearing that his troops would over pursue and fall into a trap themselves, calls off the attack. This is Washington's first clear victory of the war. Not America's, but definitely Washington's. Um, the bad news is that both Colonel Knowlton and Major Leach are killed in this action. That is considered a great loss for the American side. Interestingly, on September 16th, the day of that battle, Washington was at the mansion in the morning and he was writing a letter to Congress. And he has to cut that letter short. He doesn't finish the letter, hands it off to an aide. And the aide doesn't know whether to hold the letter or send the letter. Um, so he sends it, and then Washington finishes the letter after the battle. He writes, finishes writing what he wanted to say to Congress after the battle. And then again on September 18th, he writes to John Hancock and describes the battle in more detail. And at that time, he described it as a skirmish. I just include, these letters and what he's writing and these dates because this is what Washington's occupying his time with. This is what's going on while he's at the mansion. On September 19th, so he's still at the mansion. They've just had their first victory. The victory does a lot for American morale. We were in very bad straits prior. We're still not in great straits, but at least now we've definitely driven the British from the field, sent them running after they had, done this very insulting and dishonorable bugling during the battle. So American spirits are a little bit higher this day. And then on September 19th, the day after the battle, or no, I'm sorry, 3 days after the battle, one of the participants, a Private Leffingwell, he was during the battle, he was found fleeing from the scene by Lieutenant Reed, one of Washington's aides. And Reed told him, go back to the battle. And Leffingwell said, yes, yes, I'm going back to the battle. And then as soon as Reed turned his back and started to move on, Leffingwell went back to running away from the battle. So, Reed looked over his shoulder, saw he was running away, and he ran him down with his horse and struck him with his sword on the head. He wasn't trying to kill him, he was trying to mark him so that later they would be able to identify the man. Leffingwell falls down into a ditch and pulls out his gun and he attempts to fire at Reed. Reed pulls out his gun and attempts to fire back. Neither gun fires, and the men struggle until Leffingwell is subdued. Uh, so the man is court-martialed and he's sentenced to death by firing squad for firing at or attempting to fire at an officer. So on September 19th, at the mansion, aides and whatnot are making preparations to perform this execution that needs to be performed. And everything is being carried out to Washington's orders. And the man is lined up, the firing squad is lined up. The Private Leffingwell falls to his knees. He's begging for mercy. And right at the last moment, Washington stays the execution, and the man is spared. And when he does so, he says to everybody in attendance, "This is the last time we will show mercy." So one of the things that Washington is really struggling with is obviously morale of his troops, discipline, behavior. Um, they're really need a professional fighting force, and he's needing to show that it is not okay. If your duty is to fight with your unit, then you may not run away and give up. So this is also what Washington is dealing with while he's at Harlem Heights headquarters. Moving on to the next day. The very next day, we have the Great Fire of 1776. I imagine that we could probably do a whole episode on the fire, but just to be brief, Nathaniel Greene had recommended that New York City needed to be burned to the ground, that it could not be left for the British to occupy, that it was not good to leave them with winter quarters and everything that New York had to offer. It was just too ripe of a plum for the British to take and the Americans to allow to be taken as it was. Washington had petitioned Congress to destroy New York City, and he was denied. They said, do not destroy New York City. We will recapture it soon." Um, and so they were not allowed to burn it. But someone did burn it. And, the history leaves some question as to whether this was an accidental fire or not an accidental fire. But considering that it was quite a topic of conversation uh, long before the fire actually started, so for in the weeks leading up to uh, the fire, there was much talk, especially amongst the New England troops who, were under General Greene, that that the city should be burned to the ground. And so Washington did not give the order. We don't know if anybody gave the order, but certainly it seems like a certain number of men, probably volunteers, um went and lit the city on fire. Several fires broke out around the same time, but they weren't close enough to each other that they could have been from the same fire. Men were caught with incendiaries, with matches and whatnot. And it was quite a harrowing night for the city. Nearly 25% of the city burned. 1,000 buildings, including Trinity Church. This is a particular sore spot for those of us who work at Trinity Church because all of the records for Trinity from the 1690s through 1770s, obviously, were destroyed in the fire, and we have almost no records from that time period. Um, Washington later said, Providence or some good, honest fellow has done more for us than we were disposed to do for ourselves. So, burning the city was obviously an advantage for the Continental forces, leaving the British with not nothing, but less than they might have had otherwise. And then I'll just show a few more dates while Washington is stationed at the Harlem headquarters. He's writing to Congress requesting supplies and support for the army on October 6th. He's writing to his cousin Lund, relating about how both sides are strengthening their position. But he also takes time to tell Lund exactly how he wants him to renovate Mount Vernon. So he has like a little distraction going for him as he's giving out exacting details about renovation at Mount Vernon. But we can be rest assured that Washington is quite distressed, and he's working hard to figure out how to extricate the army from this current situation. They are stationed in Harlem Heights. They have lost New York City. They are threatened on the water by British ships, and they are afraid of being surrounded. Um, then on October 9th, let me see if I have the screen for that. No, I don't. On October 9th, the Phoenix, which we talked about earlier, and the Roebuck, um, they sail up the Hudson, and they're going to challenge Fort Washington and Fort Lee. The twin forts on either side of the Hudson River were put there to prevent the British from sailing up the Hudson, and put there to prevent the British from being able to sort of surround New York. Um, and so the British they sail up, and they're going to challenge these two forts. And sure enough, they sail, and it appears that they just breeze right up the river with no issue. To the Americans watching, it's quite disturbing. But the cannons are firing from both forts, and they're doing everything they can to take out these two ships, but the ships just sail right up the river. So it wasn't entirely as it seemed. The ships actually took considerable damage, and about 9 or 10 men on the ships were killed. But ultimately, it looked like the ships just sailed right up the river unimpeded. That also included all the ships that they had sunk in the Hudson to try to prevent this from happening, and they also had stretched a chain from Stony Point across the Hudson to it was a chain with spiked logs sticking out of it that they hoped could prevent the British from sailing up the river. But ultimately, none of it worked, and they were able to sail right past the forts. So at that point, Washington's thinking, well, these forts are useless, and they should be abandoned. They're not effective, and I'm not able to stop them from coming up the river. So we should abandon these forts. On October 12th, Washington's writing a letter. So roughly half of the army, their enlistments are going to end on December 31st. And the army is just going to vaporize into thin air. So Washington is pressing hard for to the governor of Rhode Island for more recruitment. That's one of the letters that he's writing while he's at Harlem Heights. He's also he's also petitioning hard for lots of new rules around enlistment. He wants enlistments to be much longer. He wants harsher punishment for desertion and other offenses, and he's really trying to professionalize his army, which is you know still not performing as he wants, as he hopes, and as they need to. Then on October 28th, we have the Battle of White Plains. So the Americans are stationed in Harlem Heights, but Washington has ordered the retreat from New York. And he's pulled the majority of his forces out of Harlem Heights, leaving behind just 3,000 men to defend Fort Washington, which, as we already discussed, Fort Washington was ineffective, and those 3,000 men probably should not have been left there, but they were. And so, as Washington's retreating, Howe tries to swing up above him and cut him off at White Plains. But the Americans were pretty well dug in at White Plains. They were pretty well prepared for that engagement. They didn't win, but they weren't wiped out either. Washington is then able to retreat farther north with the main thrust of the army, and then he cuts across the river and comes back down in New Jersey and back to Fort Lee. So we still have 3,000 troops at Fort Washington. We have Washington across the river at Fort Lee with the remainder of the army. Then comes on November 16th, the Battle of Fort Washington. And this image, um, this is looking south down the Harlem River. And these smoky areas would be the cannon locations that are trying to defend. This is another graphic, which there's a lot going on here, but I'll try to tell the story. Can you see my mouse? I guess I don't know if I can hear an answer on that.
Yep.
Oh, good, thank you. Here's Fort Washington, right? This is 181st Street roughly this day and age. Very close to where the bridge is, of course. Here's the Morris Mansion. Okay, this is the middle redoubt. So this is the cemetery's location here. And we have cannon facing out in all directions here as we're attempting to defend Fort Washington. Now we've only got 3,000 men, and we're spread relatively thin here at this point. So the Battle of Fort Washington, it starts with the Hessians coming across King's Bridge and this thrust from the north that attacks this cannon emplacement. Here's a depiction of that action. And this thrust continues on to Fort Washington. At the same time, a rather large force of British and Hessians are coming from the south, and they're going to run up against the middle redoubt. This is very heavy fighting happens here as the Americans are very well dug in, and the British are just pushing right up against this line. At the same time, Cornwallis is coming across the Harlem River from the Bronx, and he's coming up this way from Fort Washington to Fort Washington. And then lastly, there's a feint uh, of the Black Watch, the 42nd Regiment of the Scottish Highlanders that are coming, and they're trying to cut off any retreat from the headquarters. They're trying to cut off the retreat from the Morris House to Fort Washington. And this is this is an attack from all sides against 3,000 defenders, and it doesn't go well for the Americans. The best fighting, as I said earlier, happened at the Middle Redoubt, and it hasn't happened in my time, but I have read about lots of shot and even some cannonball being found in the cemetery as they were preparing to dig graves in more modern times. They were still finding shot and cannonball in the cemetery, which I think is fascinating. Ultimately, the Americans have to fall back into the fort, and here's the Black Watch coming up. They came up. They basically had to scale the bluffs between sort of East Harlem and West Harlem, um, which is pretty interesting. No, so here we see a little depiction of that action. This is a more contemporary map of the situation. Let me just try to give you some context. Here's Fort Washington. Here's the Morris Mansion. Here's the cemetery. It's not a cemetery at that time. It's just the Middle Redoubt, but I will always reference it as the cemetery. And we can see the Perry the Perry thrust coming up from the south. We can see the Cornwallis uh, approach here. We can see the Hessians coming across King Bridge up here. And lastly, we see the Scottish Highlanders here and the bluffs and the cliffs and their effort to get behind the Morris Mansion. So after the fall of Fort Washington, and the fall of Fort Washington was a terrible event. Nearly all 3,000 men who were there were captured, killed or captured. That represented about a third of the army at the time. Um, during the Battle of Fort Washington, as I said, General Washington was across the river in Fort Lee, but when the battle began, he was rowed in a boat across the river at great risk, obviously, considering that the British were commanding the waterways. He disembarked on the Manhattan side, and they put him on. He got on a horse and he began surveying the battlefield and trying to give orders, and eventually made it to the fort and inspected what was happening there. And then he needed a lot of persuading to get back in the boat and back across the river, but he did manage to do that and survived the day. Then 2 days later, or 4 days later, I apologize, the British make their thrust at capturing Fort Lee. So the situation at Fort Lee, and obviously I've left Manhattan now, and I'm telling the stories that come after, but I'll do it quickly. The situation at Fort Lee was that they needed to evacuate, and they needed to get all the supplies and everything they could out of the fort and across the Hackensack River. So that there's like a tongue of land that sticks out. That's between the Hudson River and the Hackensack River in New Jersey. And the only way to get any significant provisions across the Hackensack River was uh, across something known as the New Bridge. And the New Bridge was in River Edge, New Jersey, and it was north of Fort Lee. So Howe, uh, General Howe, sends his men across the river to scale the Palisades, as you can see is depicted here. And they're going to scale the Palisades and then they're going to march south to capture Fort Lee. And at the same time, Nathaniel Greene and the Americans are abandoning Fort Lee and marching north towards River Edge and the New Bridge. And so there's a sort of this race against time as these two, powers are converging on this space. And the Americans make it. They make it to the New Bridge just in time. And one of the main reasons that they made it is because General Howe insisted that his men haul their artillery up these cliffs, up the Palisades, because he wanted them for the siege of Fort Lee, and obviously he wanted them in New Jersey after that. So because they decide that they're going to bring their cannon up these cliffs, basically a very large portion of the American army is able to escape across the New Bridge, and the American engineers are dismantling the New Bridge as the British arrive there, and a skirmish occurs there. After that, we know about the long retreat. The American army then needs to retreat all the way across New Jersey and try to get to Philadelphia, because at the same time that they're trying to get to Philadelphia, the British are sailing ships down to Philadelphia, and they're going to, catch the signers of the Declaration of Independence and hang them all for their rebellion. I mentioned General Charles Lee earlier. General Charles Lee is then captured in New Jersey on December 13th. And after the long retreat to Philadelphia, we know that on Christmas night, in the overnight, General Washington leads the assault across the Delaware River in a blizzard. He marches his men 8 miles to Trenton and wins a very, very important engagement in Trenton and Princeton. And then we begin the long stalemate over New Jersey that lasts for the next 4 years. So that is my presentation. I guess we can take some questions now.
That was awesome. Thank you for that. We already have some questions in the chat. So I'll start with reading those out, but then if anybody else has any questions, feel free to use the Q&A feature to get those in there. The first one that we have is for clarity of terminology during the Revolutionary War, were the opposing parties called the British and the Americans, or were the Americans also British and the conflicting parties referred to as loyalists and patriots or something similar?
Yeah, this is a good question. At some point in 1776, I want to say, the army is officially named the Continental Army. So if you were British, you were referring to them as the rebels. If you were American, you were referring to the British as the Redcoats. Obviously, we had loyalists who were loyal to the king. And I don't know that I can speak strongly about clarity of naming, but certainly at somewhere in that time period between 1775 and 1776, this becomes the Continental Army.
Awesome. Yeah. And I think that with all things, different parties have different names for what they're calling the others. So with the British, the Continental Army were the rebels, but they were still British in their eyes. But they were rebelling Brits. So I think it depends on what lens you look at it from. So I don't know that there would ever be like a super definitive um sort of answer for that, which is the interesting thing and the fun thing about history, I guess. But our next question is, where did you read, or can one read, the correspondence Washington wrote and received while at the mansion? Is there a good book you recommend about the Battle of Harlem Heights?
Yeah, there's not a lot about the Battle of Harlem Heights. Obviously, the Battle for New York by Barnett Schechter and 1776 by David McCulloch are great resources. But there's not a lot of detail. There's only a few handwritten accounts from people who actually were in the battle or who saw the battle. Um, if you would like to read about Washington's letters, you can find them on Mount Vernon's website. Um, there's a lot of information there.
Awesome. So the next question is, what role did Africans in America play on either side of the various battles of the Revolutionary War?
Yeah, I don't know that I could speak too much on this. Certainly, we know that the British were offering freedom to any African American, any black folks who chose to fight with them. Um, and I'm not aware of how they may have participated in the Continental Army. It's something I'd like to learn more about.
That would be another great virtual program, I think. So that is a great idea for me to look into. Another question is, how did Knowlton and Connecticut troops become quote unquote elite? What experience did they have before the revolution?
Yeah, so Knowlton was involved in the French and Indian War, um, and many of his troops were veterans of the French and Indian War. So that was where most of them got their fighting experience. And then, on top of that, uh, Americans were just really hardy people at that point. They were the woodsmen, they were farmers, they were woodsmen, they all knew how to shoot, they all knew how to survive, the outdoors, and they were in their home environment. And Knowlton's Rangers were hand selected volunteers uh, that Knowlton selected himself from amongst the men that were available to him. So he, basically got his pick of the litter, and then those men, had the right to, not be involved or to join up with him.
Awesome. So I'll give one moment for any last final questions. If you have anything to pop into the Q&A, now would be your time. And then we have probably some time for one more question if anyone has one, and then we'll just wrap up for the evening. Alrighty, so I think everyone is questioned out for today. I want to thank you, Dan, for this presentation. This was so awesome to have you and to connect our two sites with all this rich history, not only with, the Battle of Harlem Heights and Washington and the Continental Army's time here, but then also in the future in the timeline of the past. As funny as that sounds, with Eliza being in Trinity. And it was just a lot of fun to have you and have you tell all these stories and really flesh out what happened way back in 1776 for us and for our audience. And you're
Well,
getting
thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to do that. I really enjoyed, you know, trying to tie the history, what was going on at the mansion and how it was playing in to the revolution. And I did promise to talk about some of the positive outcomes that came from this event, so from the New York campaign. So maybe I'll just circle back to that really quickly if I
over.
can pull up my
Yeah, and
notes.
you're getting some positive outcomes too in the Q&A. You're getting lots of compliments in there. So
Well, thank you all. Let me see what I can say here. So positive outcomes from the New York campaign, right? So generally it's thought of as just an abject failure. We were basically run out of New York and didn't didn't put up much of a fight. But the reality is that we achieved some good things. One of them was the partial destruction of New York City, and while it's not officially an act of the Continental Army, it very most likely was performed by volunteers from the Continental Army. Um, there were some really remarkable strategic maneuvers and retreats and repositioning that preserved the Continental Army. They were going up against the greatest military in the world, and they were going up and they were holding an indefensible position. And somehow they didn't get wiped out, they didn't get captured, and we're not all British at this point. Um, they proved that the British were not invincible, and that with good tactics and good leadership, they would be able to stand and fight and challenge the most powerful army in the world. Um, During the New York campaign, Washington adopts the Fabian strategy, which was essentially focusing on preserving the standing army. That under no circumstances could he do a large engagement and have his army be wiped out, and that if he manages to sustain a large army, that he could win a war of attrition, which is exactly what ended up happening. Um, there was tons of lessons learned about making a real army and discipline and new rules. One of the things that came out of it was that the flanking maneuver at the Battle of Harlem Heights had turned too soon. So Washington put new restrictions on who was to give orders and how the orders were to come, and only orders could come from three of his aides and not some of the other aides. So that was really interesting that he continued to improve their communication and how they were going to perform on the battlefield. And ultimately, the last really probably positive outcome was that we saw that the Americans were ready. They were willing to they had they were ready to demonstrate their will to fight, which was largely in question uh, up until that time. So those are some of the positive outcomes that came out of the New York campaign. And since ultimately we won, we have to take those little improvements that happened during the New York campaign and think that they all contributed to our ultimate victory.
it set the stage. It really did, for a long, drawn out war that eventually kept it so that we became Americans and aren't all British today. So yeah, this was great. I'm so happy we were able to do this. If you joined late or anything, missed a bit, want to go back, check out some of the stories and discussion again, this is going to be on YouTube. So that'll be wonderful. And I'm so happy that we were able to do this. I'm so happy that This kind of has gotten me and I hope everyone else excited for the 250th anniversary of the nation, which is coming up. And yeah, thank you all for coming and thank you so much, Dan.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right, have a great night, everyone.
Bye.